This is where it makes it a lot simpler to do, not live. Bringing peace and social justice issues into your living room, piece by piece. I'm your host, Pat Miner. It's been a while since we've visited with you, and we're happy to have you on board. And this evening, we're going to be discussing a little bit about the Syrian crisis. And we have with us our guest, Newman Abuissa, who is a naturalized American citizen, but he was born and raised in Syria. Do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, my name is Newman Abuissa, and I was born actually not too far from a street called Strait, and very close to an old church called Ananias Church. And I used to visit the church on regular basis. Saw many American and international tourists come to that church when I was small. And I had the pleasure of taking my family and my kids to the Damascus, old Damascus, and that was probably, we used to go every 2 or 3 years before the conflict started about 3 years ago. So our last time was about 4 years ago, being in Damascus, and we go there for 2 weeks just to have the kids get to see I guess the culture and experience the culture and the food and meet some of the relatives.
Yeah, that's really nice. And so what we're going to discuss today is a little bit about the Syrian crisis. I think we'll start with a little bit of history of the region in general. Can you talk a little bit about where Syria came from?
Yeah. Syria is a very old civilization. It's very old. As a country, it was established recently, but the Mesopotamia area between the two rivers goes back to the beginning of civilization. It's called the cradle of civilization, the area between the Euphrates and Tigris. And many artifacts, many human inventions started in that area. I think the head of the Louvre once said that everybody has two home countries, his own and Syria. Because Syria has really brought to humanity lots of firsts. They first invented the wheel there. They first started agriculture. They started settlement. They started domesticating animals about 10,000 years ago. They started the alphabet, which I guess is the cuneiform alphabet after the Chinese and the Egyptians had the hieroglyphic where they had symbols for each word. The Syrians were able to decipher that to put a symbol for each sound and make the basis for the language we use today. And they added the Arabic numbers, of course, are started there, and they invented the zero, which made a huge difference in the way we calculate. And every day, I guess every day we experience some of the contributions of the Syrian people to humanity.
So in a way, all of us are Syrian.
In one way, we are Syrians. And many people feel really connected to Syria. I mean, many people have soft spots for Syria in their hearts through my experience in this community here. And people are concerned about what's going on. And it's been, I guess, that is the civilization, cultural part. But the Syria has been part of every empire on the face of the earth. I mean, all the dominant empires, it's the location between the three continents of Europe, Asia, and Africa. It was the trading routes between all those continents, and all the empires had to dominate Syria to be a global force. And I think that's what we are experiencing today, is really a struggle between the global forces and their surrogates, basically between Russia, China, and on one side, and the U.S. on the other. That's globally. And locally, we have also a conflict between Turkey and Iran and Saudi Arabia and Israel and some other regional countries as well. And there's also, of course, forces in Syria for that conflict.
Yeah, and so it's not really just a Syrian conflict. It's not even just a local conflict, but really it's a global conflict.
It has many dimensions to it. Yeah, it has its own local components, and it has regional components, and it has global components.
And we'll get into that in a little more detail. But first, can you tell us, I mean, how did Syria become a country? I mean, whose idea was it to put borders around this area and call it Syria?
The Ottoman Empire was the last empire, I guess, before we went into more recent history, I guess, before France and England dominated the area. And before the France and England, I guess it was under the Ottoman Empire, and the Ottoman Empire was expanded and controlled all the area, some of Eastern Europe as well. And that went on for about 400 years, from the 1500 probably through the early 1900. And then England and France came into power, and they kind of divided the area. Sykes-Picot, I guess the two foreign ministers of the two countries looked at the area, and they draw lines in the sand, and they made countries. They gave Syria to France, Lebanon to France, Iraq to England, and Palestine to England, and Jordan to England. So they divided the countries in the early 1900s.
Yeah, and it seems like that what happened to the Middle East is that the European countries divided the area between themselves, so there's artificial boundaries there, basically, at least according to the people who live there. They're pretty artificial
those boundaries actually sometimes cross tribes and cross ethnic groups, and they don't make sense on the ground. They are base for conflict. I mean, when you have Kurdish people in Syria, in Iraq, and in Turkey and Iran, I mean, that Turkish population was not happy, and that's kind of a cause for a conflict. I mean, the things are changing over time, but I mean, from the time they were, those lines were put, did not make sense for the Kurdish people, for example. The same happens between Syria and Iraq. There is, I mean, some lines through some tribal areas where half of the tribe is in Syria and half the other tribe in Iraq, and I mean, those lines do mean some things sometimes, but they don't mean much for other times, I guess, depending what's going on.
And you mentioned before we started that the current situation really has its roots in the 80s. You want to talk a little bit about that?
I mean, the current government, the Ba'ath Party took, I think, hold of Syria in the 1970s. And the Ba'ath Party is a secular party, governs by secular rules, and it has also some tribal, ethnic, religious dimensions to it. And the Islamic forces in Syria were not happy with the secular kind of government. They tried to rebel against it in the early 80s, in 1982. And the president at the time, the father of current president Bashar al-Assad, Hafez al-Assad, crushed the rebellion in Hama in about 1982. Okay.
And you're talking about the government is currently secular, and the Muslims weren't happy about that, and there are also Christians in the area. Correct?
Yeah, I am myself a Christian. There is a Christian minority in Syria. It's estimated to be about 10% now. It used to be 15 or even 20% in the past, but the Christian minority has been under pressure in the area, and also the Christian minority have had connections with the West, and relatives go overseas, and they have easier time immigrating sometimes outside the country, and that's probably part of the reason their numbers are decreasing at a faster rate than the rest of the population.
Because the Christians have an easier time emigrating to other places? Is that what you're saying?
Even in Syria, I mean, they speak languages, and they are more connected, I guess, to foreign countries, and they have relatives sometimes. My great-grandfather came to this country in the early 1900s. My great uncle, I should say, and then my uncle came in the 1960s, and I came myself in the 1980s.
Mm-hmm. So your family, along with other families, has a history of coming to the United States.
Yes, my family specifically. I mean, as I mentioned, I came in 1983. Through this conflict here, I have my sister has 3 kids, aged between 8 and 11, and she was having a hard time in the beginning of the conflict. About a year ago, she decided to come to this country. She brought her kids here, and she is sending them to school now, and she is living in Iowa City. On the other hand, I have 2 brothers. One of the brothers who have 2 kids, he sent his kids to colleges. One of them go to Kirkwood in Iowa City, and the other is student at the pharmacy school here in town as well, at the University of Iowa. And my other brother, who is single, he is a pharmacist in Syria. And for them, Syria is their home country. It's their mother who is in need now, who many people need the pharmaceutical services. And he's just struggling through this conflict to keep serving the people as much as he can.
Yeah. And so what started, you've referred a couple of times to the situation has started, this current situation started 2.5 years ago.
Yes.
What exactly happened?
Well, actually started maybe outside Syria a little bit. I guess have some influence on what's happened in Syria. I mean, what is called the Arab Spring, and it started basically by a vendor in Tunisia who was fed up with the system, and he was selling vegetables, I think, on a cart, and the police want him to stop doing what he was doing, and that was his only way of making a living, and apparently he was doing it against some of the rules. So he put gas on himself and burned himself, and they tried to rescue him, and they took him to the hospital. He survived for a few days, I think maybe a couple of weeks, and then he died. And that was the trigger which started the revolution in Tunisia at the time. And that revolution spread to many other countries, Egypt, Libya, Bahrain, Yemen, and Syria. And I mean, Syria was caught later into that conflict, and also the other conflicts came to a resolutions fairly fast compared to what's going on in Syria. I mean, the situation in Syria is we have a strong army. Historically, the government has a strong army, and was supported by before the Russia. Now it was supported by the Soviet Union, and the army was able to fight a few wars with Israel. So they have been battle hardened, and they have lots of experience in fighting. On the other hand, we have the rebels who tried, I guess, to topple the government. And first, I mean, there was lots of factions. Still is there is lots of factions which are component of the rebels. So the rebels are not a uniform group of people who are against the government. The rebel forces span, I guess, from democratic forces to extremist Islamist forces. And when the conflict is heated and being as dangerous as it is now, usually the extreme forces take the lead into those conflicts. And that's why we see more Islamists now from Jabhat al-Nusra, who is affiliated with Al-Qaeda, and the Islamic front, I guess, in Syria and Iraq, also somewhat affiliated with the Al-Qaeda forces. They are one of the main leaders of the opposition, which are also sanctioned by the United States. And there's many other opponents to the government in Syria and outside Syria. I mean, Turkey hosts many opponents. Saudi Arabia hosts some opponents, and there's many opponents in other countries as well.
So it isn't just Syrians fighting this battle at this point?
No, it's not only Syrians fighting this battle. I mean, there's a regional dimension to this conflict. Islamists don't believe in those borders, actually. And we have fighters in Syria fighting against the government from Chechnya, from Libya, from Saudi Arabia. And the estimates are in the tens of thousands. I mean, it's becoming a jihadi cause, basically, for the extremist Muslims to establish a Islamic rule in Syria.
So basically what you have is a conflict between a dictatorship and Islamic extremists?
Those are the two, poles of the conflict. I mean, there's a lot of other forces in between. I mean, those forces usually take some roles at some times, and they don't take roles at other times. I mean, when this conflict is really, we've seen really atrocities on large scale. I guess there's about 110, 115,000 people killed by the estimates. Those are the least. I mean, the numbers could be a lot higher than those, because the number have to be, I mean, those numbers have to be documented and all that. There's a lot of people who are lost or missing, and they are not documented. There's also about 2 million people who are refugees outside the country, and there is also about 5 million people who are displaced within the country. I mean, those fights between the rebels and the government, they are not easy on the civilians populations. They usually, the civilians move away from those hot areas and try to find calmer neighborhoods and calmer places to live. And nowadays, actually, there's, I mean, large-scale starvation and people living in tents or in the streets.
Yeah, and as always, what usually happens in these conflict situations, it's the population that suffers the most and not the combatants.
I mean, the populations are suffering for no reason of their own. I mean, the
Right.
combatants are willing to suffer.
Right.
I mean, they are approaching the conflict knowing that there is suffering. I mean, the two sides are willing to do the fight. It's just the supporters of those forces, I think, have some responsibility as well. I mean, those two sides that we mentioned are supported by outside forces, and they are financed, and weapons are provided to the rebels through Saudi Arabia and through camps in possibly Jordan and other places. And on the other hand, Russia is supporting the Syrian government, and so is China and Iran, and they are supporting, what I can see is financially and from military perspective. And without, I guess, stopping the flow of weapons, it's hard to end the conflict.
So one of the things that we could be supporting if we wanted to see an end to the conflict would be to see an end to the flow of weapons into the area.
I mean, that is really one of the main reasons is for the conflict to continue. I mean, there is unemployment at this point. The economy is halved of what it used to be, and a lot of unemployment, a lot of people who are looking for things to do, and there is weapons and also money coming into the country. And those outside players are very influential of what goes on in Syria. And without the outside support, the conflict will not last as long. But as long as there is support from the outside, I think they are basically making the conflict live longer. And I think there's really no end in sight as long as the outside forces are. I mean, there's plenty of weapons in the world, and there's plenty of money. And if you keep supporting one side or the other, the conflict will go on until the Syrian people get tired. But I mean, other conflicts have lived, civil wars have lived for 10 years, 15 years, and we are only in our second, third year here now, and it could go a lot longer.
Yeah, and you mentioned that there are internal displacements and refugees who are flowing into surrounding countries.
Yes.
Iraq and Jordan and
yes. Turkey and Lebanon.
Turkey and Lebanon.
And Egypt and others.
And are those countries able to support the number of refugees that are coming in?
No, the refugees are living in dire circumstances in some of the areas. In Jordan, for example, there's large, I guess, they are detained there, and there's many shortages in many areas. And I am aware that some of the refugees chose to go back to the conflict instead of living in the refugee camps. It's as hard for them to live in the camp as it is to live under the conflict. On the other hand, I know of others who have taken the flights to Egypt, and there is human trafficking going on between Egypt and Europe, and I think at least one or two boats have sunk in the Mediterranean full of Syrian refugees trying to reach the shores of Italy and other places.
Yeah, and I also heard about some situations where the violence among the refugees, that there's particular violence of the women and the children. You know,
yes.
Human trafficking, like in some cases, for example, they are selling their young girls in order to, in some sense, keep them safe, so that they aren't raped by other people in the camps. And this is a really sad situation. I also heard that, you know, we're talking about an area that doesn't have a lot of water, you know,
yes.
and that even in the refugee camps there's a shortage of water. Is that the case?
Yeah, I mean, The whole area I mean, the water situation is interesting, I guess. The Euphrates and the Tigris go through Syria into Iraq, into the Gulf, and it starts mostly in Turkey. And Turkey has been building dams on those rivers for the last 2 or 3 decades. They've invested lots of money into building those dams to have more control. I mean, oil is plentiful in the area, but water is not. However, Syria has been blessed with enough water to survive on, even under the sanctions of the U.S. And Western sanctions on Syria for the last 2 or 3 decades. Have not had lots of impact on Syria because they have enough local resources to survive on. And they've been able to utilize their resources to the maximum. However, when you have the refugee situations, refugee camp situations, it's not as easy, and it has to be supported by governments and by institutions and by non-for-profit organizations, and all of us can help with those efforts. I mean, it's not ideal, like you said. I mean, the water is one of the shortages, but there's also medicine shortages and food shortages, and respect and schooling is in short supply.
Right.
There's lots of deficiencies into those lives. I mean, we are raising a generation without school, without sufficient nutrition and water, and that will, I mean, haunt the country in the future as well.
Yeah, I have another Syrian friend who's he also has a sister who their family, his brother-in-law was employed by the government of Syria, but one of the situations is that the government isn't paying their employees. So he hadn't been paid for several months, so they didn't have any money to live on it. And the area that they were living was becoming a hot spot, as you mentioned. And so they left the country, and they were lucky enough to not have to live in a refugee camp. But one of the issues they were facing was something else you mentioned, was that their young children weren't in school because they were in Turkey, but they don't speak Turkish. So even though they lived in a regular neighborhood, the kids couldn't go to school because there was no place for them to go to school.
Yeah, I mean, some places are really, I mean, Jordan, for example, have established the two shift schools to accommodate some of the Syrian kids. I mean, there's lots of success, but there's also lots of failures. And I mean, the situation is not ideal, but I mean, it's not, there is some schooling, and there's people going to school, and there's people, for example, my sister's kids here, they're going to the schools in Iowa City.
Right.
I mean, they are happy here, actually. They are happier here than they were in Syria because of this conflict. But not every kid has that opportunity to go to a Western country and be able to enroll at a better education system. However, I guess in the area, in Lebanon, for example, they don't have refugee camps. Most of the refugees in Lebanon, they live in homes. They rent homes, apartments, hotels, anything they can live on, and they are living within the society. And it's a large impact on the Lebanese society. And actually, this conflict is somewhat. The conflict in Syria is spilling over to Lebanon as well. I mean, Lebanon has similar composition of ethnic, religious backgrounds, similar to Syria, and those conflicts in Syria are expanding to Lebanon. And if the conflict goes on, I mean, it won't surprise me that the conflict in Lebanon will flare up at some point. I mean, they've had their own civil war in the past, and that civil war was ended, but then with the current crisis in Syria could impact the surrounding countries as well.
Well, that brings me to one situation that happened, was this week, right? That Israel bombed Syria, and they did that, they're saying, because they thought that weapons were being funneled to Hezbollah, which is the organization in, you can probably explain it better than I can, but it's an organization in Lebanon that's been against Israel, and that they have been fighting against Israel for many years. Is that the reason that they bombed Syria this last week?
Well, this last week is a series of many other bombs. This is not the last time. This is not the first time they bombed Syria.
Yeah.
They've bombed Syria in the past year, I think at least half a dozen times.
Really?
And most of the times...
This is the one that hit the United States media, right?
Well, this is the most recent one. The others also were mentioned in the media as well, but this is the most recent one. And usually I think what Israel is after, strategic weapons, reduce the Syrians. I mean, these are defensive weapons, I understand, in Syria, but the Israeli airplanes like to fly over Syria and Lebanon freely without invading their basically sovereignty almost on daily basis, and they would like to keep it that way. So they try to eliminate any weapons which could stand in their face, and they can find the excuse, I guess,
That's what I was
appropriate
going
to
to say.
them.
Basically, they find an excuse and then they just drop
Well, I mean,
the
the
bombs.
bottom line is Syria is trying to get rid of the chemical weapons through international treaty now, and the Syrian government
Yeah,
has.
let's go back a little bit and explain. Was a couple of months ago there was an incident in which chemical weapons were apparently used on civilians. I think there's some discussion as to whether it was the government that did that or the rebels that did it. But in any case, chemical weapons were certainly used, is my understanding. And then the UN looked into it, and the UN decided that there were chemical weapons used, and that was back when the United States was talking about bombing Syria.
Crossing the red line. Oh,
Yeah.
President Obama.
Of using chemical weapons, and then at the last minute, I remember exactly how that played out. The United States, was it Russia that went to Syria and said, let's go to the United Nations? Is that how it happened? Do you remember?
In Syria, it's have really had chemical weapons, I think, for a while. Syria has been to the United Nations trying to get rid of all weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East. And those efforts were not supported in the past. Syria, like you mentioned, there was some use of chemical weapons in the conflict. It was on a very small scales initially, about 6 months ago, I think, and dozens of people died at that time initially. I think one of the use was against government army unit, and the Syrian government allowed the United Nations chemical weapons inspectors to come to Syria to investigate the use of chemical weapons, thinking that they will be pointing to the rebels. Usually the truth is the first thing we lose in wars. I mean, you never know who are the players and whose, I guess, objective is being met and all that, and who's behind what. So when the chemical weapons inspectors arrived to Damascus that same day, chemical weapons on a larger scale was used in Damascus suburbs, and I think 1,500 people, according to some estimates, have lost their life. Some of them are children and women, and some of them are rebels as well. And at that point, the American position was that the Syrian government has crossed. They already decided that it was the responsibility of the Syrian government by American government position, I guess, at that time. And President Obama said that we are going to bomb Syria to let them know that this action cannot be done without consequences. I remember standing in the old Capitol Mall. All the Iowa City people were against getting involved in the conflict in Syria, and we protested that initiative on the American government side to get involved in the Syrian conflict. I called my representative, Congressman Lobsack's office, myself, and they told me the calls are coming to this office 99% against the bombing, against getting involved, and only maybe 1% is supporting that involvement. And we've had discussions and panel discussions and other discussions at that time. And I'm glad that the American government changed their position.
Yeah. I actually spoke with Congressman Lobsack in person during that period, and he told me that he would not, that he believed that the government did use chemical weapons, but he didn't think the right thing to do was to bomb Syria. So, yeah, they apparently did listen to us, and
well, I mean,
not just us.
Yeah, after this conflict was heated up between basically the American government and the Syrian government, then I guess our Secretary of State, John Kerry, was asked, what can Syria do to
Right,
avoid
Yeah.
this conflict? And he said, well, they can get rid of their chemical weapons
Right.
if they want to do it. And the Russians jumped on the situation, I mean, on the statement. They took the statement to the Syrian government. They convinced the Syrian government that this is the right approach to resolve this conflict. And the Syrian government agreed to it within hours. And they proposed back to the United States that the Syrian government is willing to get rid of their chemical weapons if you are willing to stop the bombing campaign. And I think President Obama was, I mean, also having a hard time convincing Congress to agree to, I mean, he first was going to go to war without Congress, then he decided to go to Congress for their authorization, and then the feeling from the Congress, at least from the, I mean, the Senate might have approved it, but the Congress has, it's almost impossible for the Congress to approve that kind of bombing. And then he was handed the kind of out option, and he chose to take to dismantle the chemical weapons, which is going, I guess, on schedule as far as we know. And according to the United Nations reporting recently, they've dismantled all the weapons capability, and they will seems to be going on schedule to get rid of all the chemical weapons in Syria, which are, I mean,
which is what the Syrian government wanted in the first place, right?
Well, they wanted the whole area to be free of weapons of mass destructions. Hopefully, if Syria started, I mean, Iran is basically developing some nuclear capabilities, and it's known that Israel is the other country who have nuclear capability. The other two countries which used to have chemical weapons were Iraq and Libya. Were having some efforts. Both countries got rid of their chemical weapons, and both countries' governments were toppled as well after that.
Yeah, and so it'll be interesting to see whether this works in Syria. I mean, I think you're right in terms of weapons of mass destruction. Part of the issue is that Israel is the one who has nuclear bombs, and you know they won't openly admit it. And I read the other day that the United States has agreed not to talk about it openly. So. Yeah. You know, I mean, it's hard to talk to somebody about getting rid of their weapons of mass destruction when they don't even admit that they have them.
Yeah, they are not signatory to the treaties. So. I mean, there are international treaties to controlling chemical weapons and nuclear weapons, and they are not signatory. So, I mean, that's enough indication to me that they do develop those kind of weapons.
Well, of course, we won't digress into Israel, but of course, a man named Mordecai Vanunu, who worked in the facility many years ago, made it public, and he has pictures to prove it. So.
Yeah, I mean, Israel is a big force in the Middle East. Is the largest force in the Middle East, and they try to impose their way on the surrounding countries. I mean, Syria has had in the past some army, I guess, to stop the hegemony of Israel and stop Israel, I guess. But now with the Syrian government fighting the rebels, their capabilities are reduced significantly. And the only counterbalance, I guess, in that area, at least to Israel, is Iran. And Iran now, we have more moderate governments trying to approach the West and trying to moderate their positions. So there is some hopeful, I guess, signals which could lead to possible solutions in the future. But for the immediate future here, I don't see a resolution, I guess, between the warring factions, especially the conflict between maybe Iran and Saudi Arabia. I mean, Saudi Arabia was upset about the American positions backing away from bombing Syria. They wanted
Saudi Arabia wanted to bomb Syria?
Saudi Arabia wants
really? I didn't know
the
that.
United States to bomb Syria. I mean, they want the
right.
American.
And why was that?
They are against the current government. They want to replace Assad, and they are supporting the rebels as well. And it's a well-known fact in Syria, and they were not happy.
I'm sure. I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah, and they got upset. I guess they even had they were elected to be on the Security Council, and they chose.
Oh, that's right.
And they chose not to hold. I mean, to
and that's
give up the seats and to show their discontent with the international community and the American.
Well,
government.
and I don't know. How do you think that? I mean, the fact that they're not on the Security Council, would that have been a good thing for the area if Saudi Arabia had been on the Security Council? Apparently they don't think so.
I'm not gonna diverge to the Saudi Arabia, I guess, fact.
Yeah.
I mean, they are becoming. I mean, they are influential country in the Middle East. Let's put it that way. They are influential within the Gulf region, with the oil-producing countries, and they are also influential internationally. I guess most recently they have been exporting more oil to Asia than to the West. Eastern Asia is probably is the home of half of the global population, and also almost half of the global trade is going on in Asia. And the American government is trying to pivot our concentration from the Middle East to East Asia too, but that is proving to be hard because of the conflicts in the Middle East and their history. But East Asia, basically China, India, Japan, Indonesia, and a few other countries, big countries in that area, are really the hub of commerce and trade, and they are becoming influential in the global system as well.
You mentioned that your sister came over. Can you talk a little bit more about that process, or how it physically happened?
Well, my sister is lucky because she really had residency in the United States before the conflict started. And she had the option to come to the United States before she chose to live in Syria, because she was raised and got her degree from Syria, and it was easier for her to find a job, establish her family in Syria, and raise her kids in Syria until the conflict started, which make it next to impossible to raise kids in that conflict. And then she had that option to come here.
So she had dual citizenship?
She had dual citizenship, yeah. I mean, both the United States and Syria allow for two citizenship, so you can hold two citizenships in both countries. Actually, interesting fact, just recently I heard that some of the Syrian Christians have been asked the Russian government to grant them citizenship. They want to be protected by the Russian government, thinking that if the rebels took over and they don't want to leave Syria, but they also need some international protection. So they are trying to apply. I don't know if that will
like double, so they would have Syrian and Russian citizenship? Are they close to the Russian border so that they would be part of Russia also? Or
no, it'll be a satellite probably.
Just like you having American citizenship.
Yeah, it's more psychological probably, and more than tangible. But I mean, it just shows you that the people, Christians in Syria, they've lived there and they coexisted with the Muslims. I mean, unlike other conflicts in the past where when one party gets rid of the other party. But that was not the case in Syria. I mean, the Christians had some conflicts in the past with the Muslim neighbors, but they were able to survive. I mean, they survived over centuries. I mean, Islam started about 1400 years ago, and Christianity started 2000 years ago, and the Christians were there first. I mean, their numbers, composition changed, but they were able to survive. And I mean, I grew up in Syria in close to normal conditions when I was growing up. And it was normal only until like 2 or 3 years ago. I mean, the Christians community live in some different areas in some places, but they're integrated in other places also in Syria. So they are part of the Syrian fabric, and the Muslims accept them, and they accept their Muslim neighbors, and they coexist. And
like a lot of the other
And Syria is very rich, actually, in many different, for example, the street I lived on has 10 different churches, Christian churches with different denominations, and they all coexisted. And also in Islam, we have the Shia Muslim, the Sunni Muslims, the Sufis, the Ismailis, and a few others. And they all coexist in Syria until this recent conflict, where the most fight is happening now between the Sunni and the Alawite Muslims.
So is there fighting between Muslims and Christians then?
The Christians are associated somewhat with the government, and those who are associated with the government are sometimes in the army and fighting with the governments. But most of the Christians, some of the Christians, are with the rebels as well.
Because Assad is Alawite, which is
mostly because it's secular, I guess. It suits the Christian existence to have a secular rule rather than religious rule.
But in the past, there's been Islamic rule, and the Christians have still lived there. Is that correct?
I mean, the Islamic rule was during the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was fierce on the Christians within Turkey, but they were not have that much influence on the Syrians within Syria. I mean, the Muslims in Syria allowed or were able to allow the Syrians to live in Syria, the Christian Syrians to live in Syria, even though they were under the Ottoman rule. I mean, the Ottomans have purged Turkey from all the Christians. I mean, the same thing happened in Spain, for that matter. All the Christians in Spain have purged all the Muslims out. I mean, there's no tolerance. In Syria, that was not the case. The Christians coexisted, they continue to exist, and they are present today. I mean, our church's headquarters is still in Damascus, and our patriarch is in Damascus. One of the bishops, who is the brother of the patriarch, is kidnapped, has been kidnapped for a few months now with another bishop from another church. And it's not easy.
So part of the conflict is along religious lines, would you say? And I guess I'm just wondering if the Islamists did gain control, if you would see some more problems with Christians and maybe other minority groups in Syria.
I mean, there's moderate Muslims and there's extremist Muslims.
Right.
The moderate Muslims have, I mean, Islam in general allow Christianity, allow Muslims to marry Christians, allow interactions, and they have some rules about coexistence and not. There's no force in religion, and there's many principles in Islam which allow coexistence.
Right.
However,
so I'm wondering, we're not even talking about religious differences, but the difference between extremism and moderation.
Yes.
Whether it's religion or politics or any other, purity, is that there are extremists who think that they're the only their way is the only way there is.
Yeah.
And then you have the people who think that we all ought to accept each other. So it's not really about religion or politics.
It's more about extremism. I mean, you see the extremism in any religion, for that matter.
Right.
I mean, Islam doesn't have. Is not the only religion which have extremists. I mean, you see extremists in every religion. And just like you described, I mean, there's the purists. I mean, people who want to take the rule to the letter. I mean, there's the human dimension, and there's the culture, and there's and also the people who are connected to a rule, and they only see the rule, and they interpret it in a very narrow way. I mean,
well, you certainly see that in Christians in the United States. They have a very narrow definition of what Christianity is, and some of those people don't accept anything except fundamentalist Christians.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective as an Orthodox Christian myself, I mean, I consider the Christianity came from, I mean, was documented by the people. I mean, the people who witnessed Jesus on earth and documented. I mean, they have a human interpretation to the religion, and they, I consider our church is the church who wrote the book, who wrote the Bible, and edited the Bible and published the Bible. So, I mean, those rules were interpreted by people and had a human interpretation. It's not a rule which is outside the human behavior or the human, I guess, moral issues. I mean, it's within our grasp basically to interpret those rules. And then when people are from my perspective outside the area and they try to take the rules to extremes, then that could become a problem.
I think that's a problem in any situation. I mean, I can think of situations again in the United States, because that's what I'm familiar with, where I was listening to a slam poetry. Are you familiar with that? And this particular poem was about the non-acceptance of, in some aspects of Christianity, of gay and lesbians. But the whole idea of what this young man was saying in this poem is that it's his understanding that God is love, and that what that meant to him was that God accepted all of us for who we are. And I think that that's maybe the dynamic that we're seeing in a lot of conflicts, not just in Syria and not just in Christianity or Islam, but all across the board. You know, the conflict is between those who have this very narrow focus, whether it's political or religious or.
Yeah, I agree. I think, I mean, when the people who are extremists and they are taking larger roles than they deserve, and that is because the people who are moderate, they are not imposing their position on the extremists. So in my opinion, that the people who are moderate in their interpretations need to be strong and influence other people with their interpretations and their understanding, and not allow the extremists only to be heard.
Right.
I think the moderates, even though their positions might not be as flashy or as easy to interpret, but they need to take a larger role in the society, in any society for that matter, including the Syrian society, that they will be the dominant force to influence the society and its future.
So what would that look like in Syria? I mean, what do you see? What would you like to see happen in Syria? What would you like to see? You know, how do you imagine that the conflict there could end, or do you imagine that it can?
It's hard really to see the how it's going to end. I think it's a large conflict with many dimensions, and we are seeing the first stages of this conflict. So I expect that this conflict will stay with us for many years, and to know exactly how it's going to end is not going to be easy. But we already know that the conflict does not have a military solution, and that neither the government nor the rebels can win this conflict with the current, I guess, criteria. So it has to be a negotiated conflict. A negotiated conflict has to include all the players and reach to a middle ground which is acceptable to the majority of the Syrians.
So who are all the players in Syria? Would you include only Syrians? Or because we talked about it being a regional and global conflict?
It has to be the Syrians plus their regional and global sponsors. All of them have to come to the table and figure out their interests and resolve those conflicts in the interests.
How can we do that? I mean, we're talking about the UN stepping in?
The UN has already stepped in. I mean, we already have a Geneva one, and they put the foundation for a Geneva II convention on Syria. And that Geneva II convention in Syria is supposed to be held by November of this year, by the end of November of this year. And that was the criteria put by Russia and the US, and they agreed to it. And there is some movements, I guess, going toward it. But then the rebels are not being unified to participate, and that is causing some issues about which party or what part of the rebels is going to be representing the Syrian opposition, and that becoming an issue. The same thing with Saudi Arabia is being upset. They don't want Iran to be participating, but Iran wants to participate, and the US is not quite sure, I guess. But I mean, to reach a resolution, you have to include all the players, even if you don't like them. I mean,
well, that's part of it. I mean, if you make a negotiation with your friends, how does that solve the conflict, right?
Yeah, you
have to include everybody, especially if you don't like them. It seems to me. I mean, I think one of the issues is what you mentioned is the fact that the rebels, what everybody calls the rebels, aren't a unified group.
Yes.
You know, you have some. Am I right about this? You have some.
Moderate or
moderate
democratic
people,
forces.
Some who want democracy. Then you have what I've heard called the extremists, who, you know, again think they're the ones that
are taking more and more role these days.
They are taking more and more role.
I mean, maybe a year ago the moderates were more powerful and they could have represented the opposition. But nowadays the extremists are more effective and more present.
I know in some of the cases, I think it's widely understood that in many of these Arab Spring countries, they were moderates in the beginning, at least. Is that you saw in a lot of cases moderates, people who wanted democracy in their dictatorship countries. I'm more familiar with the Libyan situation, but that's how the conflict started there, for example, is that you had the moderates saying they didn't like, there was a specific incident in Libya, and I don't want to take the time to explain it, but there was a specific incident in Libya where they said, the moderates said, we don't like what the government is doing in this particular case. But it very quickly, and I don't know if there was something like that in Syria, but very quickly what happens is other people say, yeah, let's fight against the government. It sounds like a good time to fight. And of course then you have, extremists. And because the situation in Libya and in other Arab countries happened so quickly. I mean, Libya had a civil war, but it only lasted for 4 months.
With the Western intervention.
And that's right, with Western intervention. And except that in that particular case, I think what's different between, at least the way I see it, between Libya and Syria is that the Libyans asked for intervention. And I don't know if the Syrians, have they specifically asked for the United States to intervene?
The rebels have asked, the rebels were ready for the U.S. to intervene, and they were ready to jump on the bandwagon. I mean, the force is not as simple as,
But the point was that the longer the situation goes on, the more opportunity you have for extremists or whoever else to jump on the bandwagon and say, oh, let's be a part of this.
I mean, they also, the forces in this regional forces like Saudi Arabia and Iran, they are not interested in democracy. I mean, they are not democratic themselves.
Right.
And they are supporting one side or the other. So you do not expect democracy to flourish when dictatorship or other kind of form of governments are supporting different factions within the Syria. And I mean, it happened that Saudi Arabia crushed the democratic forces in Bahrain, and nobody said a thing about that. I mean, the army in Saudi Arabian army is present in Bahrain today, and they are crushing the opposition. And it's not, I guess it does not make the news because it's acceptable apparently by the players.
And in some ways Libya is still, I mean, they're definitely still in conflict situation. It's not called a civil war anymore.
And Libya is in a bad situation actually, as I understand it now. The only functioning ministry is the oil ministry in the country, and everything else, the education and the health and many other parts of the government are not functioning well because of the conflicts going on.
And Egypt is still in turmoil. So, I'm not sure that just because we're not calling it civil war anymore means that it's more, in lots of cases, some of these people wish they were back to a benevolent dictatorship.
Yeah, I mean, the time of dictatorship has gone. I guess they need to move to the next step and step and step. So there is many steps in this process, and it's going to take the people some time to reach prosperous society, and it will take longer if the outside countries are not supporting that kind of resolution.
So the first step is to find a way to stop the fighting, is the killing. Stop the killing. Right, that's our next step.
Yeah, I mean, it's simpler said than done. It's not.
Oh, I understand.
I mean, the government have strong control of many parts of Syria, and the rebels have control of many parts of Syria. And if this continues, I mean, this is a map for dividing the country, and that is not a good.
Do they have like?
In some areas are clear, but some other areas are contested. There's not a clear division, but there is. I mean,
there is some discussion about dividing the country.
it's not. I mean, the discussion. I mean, who's discussing what? But I mean, the forces on the ground are being governed by one side or the other, and they might be able to negotiate and come back under a federal, possible federal system where they can have one area be influenced more than other area, I guess. On the other hand, I mean, yeah, it could be divided too. I mean, Iraq has been, I mean, the Kurdish area in Iraq has been almost sovereign. I mean, outside doing their own things within the Iraqi government.
Right.
I mean, they still have, they are part of the country, but they make a lot of their own decisions. They have their own airports. They have their own sometimes visas and stuff like that. So, I mean, the divisions can take many different shapes. But hopefully we won't get to that point in Syria. But I really don't, nobody knows the outcomes.
Well, we just got the 5-minute warning, and so I don't want to leave the show without us talking about what people listening, how they can inform themselves. I think one of the things we did this time is we put up on the screen both your email address and my email address.
Okay.
If anybody has any questions, they can email us directly. There is the University
of Iowa Center for Human Rights.
Center for Human Rights has a committee together that is working on things like making sure we're looking into this, making presentations in the schools, at maybe making some more of these shows to get more interest out there. There will be further presentations. I'm sure if you want to continue, if you want to look for information on the University Human Rights website, which is also, it's a .edu, UICCHR.edu. And again, I think that'll be on the screen. And there will have been, and I don't know of any specific events, fundraising events going on in the near future. But if you watch your newspaper, there probably will be more of those going on in the near future as well. People in Iowa City are getting together to raise funds, and a lot of them are going through the United Nations. We're going directly to the United Nations, giving money through the United Nations so that they can bring help. One of the things that's going on is that there are some book bags that are being put together for children that are in these refugee camps. Money is also going to the UN for food and water for the refugees in Syria and in their surrounding countries, Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan. So there are some fundraising things going on, and other informational seminars and things going on.
Yeah, and I'll be glad to attend any of your communities or churches and answer any questions you might have about Syria. I have been in this country for 20-some years, and I've lived also 23 years, I guess, more in the U.S. now than in Syria. But I still I have lots of connections in Syria, and I follow the conflict very closely. And I'll be glad to come to any of your churches or communities to talk to you and answer any questions you might have. I want to also take this opportunity to thank the public in Iowa City here for their generous support of the Syrian, I guess, United Nations efforts in Syria for the Syrian refugees. And also, I want to thank them for their concerns and their support during recently about stopping the bombing campaign in Syria. There was lots of support and concern from what I see in this community here for the Syrian people, and I appreciate that. Yeah,
we did have a forum a few weeks ago, and more than 200 people we tried to squeeze into this little room, and it was gratifying for me to see the people in this town that were really concerned about this issue. This was before the United States decided not to bomb Syria, and a lot of people came out for that forum, and I was really proud to be part of this community that evening. Thank you very much for being with us today.
My pleasure.
And we appreciate everything you're doing, and thank you, and we'll talk to you again. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat.
I'm going to assume we're out.